Welcome back to the channel. I'm the Dynasty Football Strategist, and in today's video, we're going to learn my top 24 Dynasty wide receiver rankings. So, what goes into Dynasty wide receiver rankings? Well, the player's age does, their quarterback does, their short-term and long-term outlook does, their upside does, and where they are on the depth chart are a couple things that we need to look for in these players. So with that being said, let's get right into the video. So, what we've all been waiting for, my top wide receiver. My top wide receiver is... My wide receiver 24 is Nathaniel Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. He's 24 years old and going into his second year in the league. He's coming off a broken leg, which he suffered after an impressive string of games. And here's why he's not higher on the list. The Texans decided to make a move for Bills wide receiver Stefon Diggs and trade for him. That brings in a lot of immediate competition for targets, and he also has to contend with Nico Collins as well. So it's kind of crowded there, but he is attached to CJ Stroud, so that's a wonderful thing for his long-term outlook. I'm just not quite as high on him in the short term. I think he's going to be third on the depth chart, at least for this year. So you can expect good things in the future, just maybe temper your expectations for this year. I project him to be a low-end wide receiver 2 this year with a couple spike weeks here and there. So funnily enough, my wide receiver 23 is his teammate Nico Collins. Nico Collins is a year older than him, but he's going into year 4 now, and he is the X-wide receiver for this offense, and likely to be the projected top target earner, even if it's not by that many targets this year because of the crowded nature of their wide receiver room. But in terms of long-term upside, he's connected with Stroud for years, so he should be at the very least a solid wide receiver 2 for many, many years. And once Stefon Diggs leaves, he'll go back to being their clear number 1 target, I think. And being connected to CJ Stroud, he's going to give you a lot of good fantasy years for years and years to come. My wide receiver 22 is Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. He's age 22 going into his second year. Speaking about his quarterback situation, he did lose Kirk Cousins, who is wonderful for his weapons, but the Vikings did draft J.J. McCarthy in the top third of the first round. So it remains to be seen from a production standpoint how exactly it'll work out for him this year. But for the long term, I really do like Jordan Addison, especially when Justin Jefferson was out this past year. He had some really high highs, and while he may not be the most consistent player, his long-term outlook shouldn't be of your concern because he is one of the better route runners in the league and separators. And he's going to be on an offense with a coach that knows how to utilize his players. So expect high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2 numbers from him overall this year, with some kind of big boom weeks and kind of low weeks while the offense gets going. My wide receiver 21 is George Pickens, wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So he is 23 years old, and he's going into his third season. He is coming off a 1,000-yard season. I'm just not so sure I like this offense, to be honest. So they have Arthur Smith coming in, and don't like that. He also has Dangerous Wilson and Justin Fields throwing him the ball. That's really not ideal. Now, he is the number 1 target, so that's good. I just don't know how much I really like for the short term the number 1 target in an Arthur Smith-led offense with Russell Wilson and Justin throwing him the ball. So long term, definitely not worried. Just this year, I think he's going to have very high variance from week to week, and it's going to be hard to start and trust him, at least this year, which may impact his dynasty value. But it remains to be seen, and we'll just have to see how this plays out. My wide receiver 20 is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He's 23 years old and going into his second year in the league. He's connected to Lamar Jackson for at least 3 more years, probably 4, assuming they pick up its 5th-year option. And as far as his long and short-term upside, his short-term upside is pretty high. He's the number 2 target on the offense behind Mark Andrews. And by the end of his rookie contract, he should probably be the number 1 target among the Lamar Jackson receivers. So things are looking good for him in the short and long term, really. As far as upside, he probably projects as a low-end wide receiver 2, but he could have big boom weeks. He's had multi-touchdown games already in his career and showed out in the playoffs, so things are really looking up for him, and he projects to be their number 1 receiver for years to come, so a lot to like about him. My wide receiver 19 is Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. He was picked 20th overall this past year in the first round, and he was put in a bad situation where he was behind DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. DK Metcalf is there to stay most likely, but Tyler Lockett will for sure be gone after this next year. He's going to cost the Seahawks $25 million at that point, and there's no way they're going to keep on to an age 32-year-old receiver at that price. So at worst, he's the wide receiver 2 this next year, but I really think he takes over the role this year. He has elite athleticism in terms of his agility, and he can win inside or outside, but he's especially dangerous in the slot. He's connected to Geno Smith, which isn't ideal, but it could definitely be worse than that, and he should be his quarterback's best friend this year. In terms of his upside, as soon as Lockett leaves, I project him to be a high-end wide receiver 2 through volume, sort of an Amon-Ra St. Brown type of player. He just, as of this moment right now, isn't quite in the position that Amon-Ra is in, and he isn't quite as talented either, but he'll project to be a similar type of player in due time. My wide receiver 18 is Devonte Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So he's 25 years old, going into his 4th year, so he's still relatively young. He just signed an extension in Philadelphia, so he'll have Jalen Hurts with him for at least a couple more years, so that's great for him. He is, however, the number 2 target in this offense, which isn't ideal, but he's a relatively consistent player, and he's more so safe than explosive in terms of how he provides his fantasy outings. But in terms of his long-term upside, if A.J. Brown were to ever leave, Devonte Smith could probably be a low-end wide receiver 1, so if that were to happen, he would be a big, massive buy. But I probably reasonably project him to be a kind of mid-wide receiver 2, at least for the short term. My wide receiver 17 is Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So he's 26 years old, going into his 5th year. He is a target hog, and he was just re-signed on a 3-year extension to be the team's wide receiver 1. As far as his quarterback situation, it's somewhat murky. We're not really sure how Anthony Richardson's going to work out. It's just his 2nd year, and he did have a season-ending injury in week 5, so let's give him some time. But he still produced and was a target hog even with Gardner Minshew at quarterback, so I have no worries about him with a laser-armed quarterback, and especially under Shane Steichen. He's one of the best play callers in the NFL, and I trust in him above all else, if anything. As far as his long-term and short-term stability, his short-term stability is great. He's the wide receiver 1 easily, hands down. And it's probably the same thing for his long-term outlook. They did draft Addison Mitchell to be a field-stretching X and still to allow Pittman to play the Z position, but that really shouldn't affect his target volume too much, even if AD Mitchell receives a little bit more target volume than Alec Pierce did. But as far as his upside, he's most likely at worst a mid-wide receiver 2, probably a high-end wide receiver 2 with a very high floor, but just somewhat of a limited ceiling from week to week, but a great asset to own and still only 26 years old. My wide receiver 17 is DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. He's 27 years old and for now is the wide receiver 1 of this team, but I don't think he's going to be for the future. they just drafted Caleb Williams first overall to play quarterback, which I think is fantastic for him, especially in the short term. He's much better than Justin Fields ever was or will be. However, they also drafted Rome Odunze, an ex-wide receiver at pick 9, and he's an elite prospect in his own right. And I think as soon as year 2, he's going to kind of out-target DJ Moore and relegate him to the wide receiver 2, which isn't terrible by any stretch of the imagination, especially in a Caleb Williams-led offense. I just think his value is a little bit inflated considering what's most likely to happen to him in the future. As far as his upside goes, he's probably a mid-wide receiver 2 this year, maybe high-end depending on the target distribution, but I think it's going to fade into him being a mid to low-end wide receiver 2 as soon as this next year, and I think his fantasy value is really going to take a hit because of this. My wide receiver 15 is Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. He's age 26 going into his 5th year, so his long-term outlook is kind of murky. He's having contract issues with them. He wants $30 million a year, and they're not prepared at this time, or maybe ever, to give that to him. So he's probably going somewhere else in the long term. But for right now, he's connected to Brock Purdy and Kyle Shanahan, so a great quarterback and coach. So short term is good. He's the number 1 target, although the target distribution isn't quite what it is in other offenses. It's more spread out in this instead of focused on a one like it is in some offenses. So as far as his upside, he's probably a high-end wide receiver 2 this year. Pretty consistent guy. If he gets traded, who knows though. He could definitely reach higher highs if he's more of the alpha target on a team in the future. My wide receiver 14 is Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. He's age 25 going into his 4th year, and he's had a very good career despite the down year he had somewhat due to injury this past year. For instance, he finished as a top 10 wide receiver just 2 years ago. He has a fairly good quarterback in Tua Tagovailoa. Doesn't have the best arm, but he's also in a great scheme with Mike McDaniel there, who knows how to utilize speed, and boy does his team have a lot of speed. So as far as his short-term outlook, he is the number 2 behind Tyreek Hill, but Tyreek Hill's getting up there in age, so it's really only a matter of time before he's the dominant wide receiver 1 again. And he has weekly elite wide receiver 1 upside. It's just kind of fluky when he's the number 2 in this offense. So his long-term outlook is looking great, and he just signed an extension, so he's going to be in a good explosive offense for years to come. As far as his fantasy output, he's probably likely to be a mid to high-end wide receiver 2, unlikely to really reach wide receiver 1 status, barring a Tyreek Hill injury this year. My wide receiver 13 is Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. He's age 23 going into his 3rd year, and his quarterback situation, to be honest with you, isn't very good. Derek Carr is pretty bad. I don't really believe in Spencer Rattler, the player they drafted in the 5th round this year. Dennis Allen is a pretty poor head coach with almost no leadership ability. But he is the number 1 target on the offense by far. Alvin Kamara is their 2nd best receiver, and he's a running back that's aging. Rashid Shaheed, So really none of the talent around him is inspiring. So you can expect at the very least solid wide receiver 2 production from Olave year in and year out. It's just, can he really maximize his ceiling? And really that remains to be seen, but that's why he's at 13. He's still a really young asset with plenty of time to improve on himself, but he's been a consistent wide receiver 2 for the first 2 years of his career. My wide receiver 12 in Dynasty is Tyreek Hill, wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins. He is age 30, so he is getting up there in age, but man is he effective when he plays. He has the potential any given year to be probably the number 1 fantasy player. He's that speedy and good, and he's in a great offense that utilizes his strengths, speed and agility, and route running on all 3 levels of the field. Thank you, Mike McDaniel. So it's really just about when the bottom's going to come out from under him. We're not really sure about that. Like I said, he's age 30, but he is number 1 on the depth chart. He has a solid situation around him. They can't really double team him because of Jaylen Waddle and the running game that they have there now. Mike McDaniel's great. Tua Tagovailoa is fine. Nothing to worry about there. So he's really going to be a bona fide elite wide receiver 1 for the short term, and then he's going to probably bottom out. So that's why he's a little bit further down in these rankings. If he was 5 years younger, he'd be much closer to the top. He might even be the number 1 wide receiver. My wide receiver 11 is Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. He's a rookie, age 22, going into what for the short term isn't an ideal situation, but what I think is going to be massive for his potential in the long term. So Caleb Williams was drafted to be their quarterback, first overall this year. Elite prospect. I think he's going to be a stud. There is a crowded wide receiver situation, though, with Keenan Allen being there on a 1-year deal. He should man the slot. Rome Odunze should be the X, and DJ Moore should be the move Z receiver. But there's 3 elite targets, at least for year 1, so I think Rome Odunze is going to be a high-end wide receiver 3, maybe if he gets lucky, a low-end wide receiver 2. But I think as soon as next year, he's going to take over the number 1 role from DJ Moore, and he's going to be an elite wide receiver 1 very, very soon. He was drafted 9th overall, and in just about any other class in recent memory, he would easily be the number 1 prospect. This guy is a go-getter. When the ball's in the air, it is his ball. He will bully anyone. It would not shock me if he scored 12 or more touchdowns in his rookie year on a limited target basis. So as far as his upside for the future, he has the potential, and I think he will be, an elite wide receiver 1 as soon as he can get the number 1 role. An offense with Caleb Williams is going to lead to a lot of success, and they're going to be a special pairing in the future. The first wide receiver in the top 10 is Drake London, wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons. He's going into his 3rd year, and he's only age 22. He's still young and ascending. He has dealt with terrible quarterback play and a horrible head coach. As a Ravens fan, I'm very glad Arthur Smith is going to the Steelers. Thank you for eating that bullet. So, as far as Drake London goes, though, he's the undisputed number 1 target in the offense. He should get more targets than Kyle Pitts, but they should be a good 1-2 punch. As far as receivers, though, he is easily the number 1 target. Darnell Mooney will get a couple targets a game, but it's not even close. Bona fide wide receiver 1, Drake London. He's getting not only Kirk Cousins in free agency, but if Kirk Cousins doesn't heal from his Achilles properly, they drafted Michael Penix 8th overall. So he has 2 capable quarterbacks, most likely at least. And for the short term, fantastic. And for the long term, he's still going to be the wide receiver 1. So I think he's going to be at worst a low-end 1 this year, and I think he's going to challenge to be a mid-wide receiver 1 for this year and in the future. My wide receiver 9 is A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. He's 26, set to turn 27 in about 5 days here. And if he was just a little bit younger, he would definitely be way further up this list. Now, he's not old by any stretch of the imagination. He's, in fact, probably right in the smack dab middle of his prime. And he's in a great situation where Jalen Hurts is his quarterback, and he's signed an extension, so he's locked in for a short-term role and long-term role with the Eagles. He's also the bona fide wide receiver 1 there. Devonte Smith is a solid 2, but he's definitely not going to be taking too many targets from A.J. Brown. As far as A.J. Brown's upside, you should expect wide receiver 1 numbers year in and year out, probably mid wide receiver 1 numbers, but he does have the ability any given year to be an elite wide receiver 1. Wide receiver 8 is Malik Neighbors, rookie wide receiver for the Giants. He's only 20 years old, so he has a ton of potential. He is going to be the undisputed number 1 target. Wan'Dale Robinson is the next best player, if that tells you anything. He's going to get fed early and often, and while his quarterback situation isn't ideal in Daniel Jones, or Janiel Dones as he called him, if that says anything, His role is definitely secure, and he's going to get schemed touches, so it really doesn't matter what defenses try to do. This guy's a walking touchdown. He's going to get fed and schemed. He's going to be an elite wide receiver one, I think, from the jump, but at worst, he's going to get enough raw volume to have a Garrett Wilson type of career beginning, which a high-end wide receiver 3, low-end wide receiver 2 wouldn't be the end of the world, but he's capable of being the number 1 wide receiver. I comped him to Jamar Chase coming out, but with more explosion somehow. This guy is going to be an elite wide receiver 1 for years and years. My wide receiver 7 is Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. Wow, what a surprise this last year. So, he projects to be a solid wide receiver 1 out of nowhere. As a 5th round pick, nobody saw this coming. He's connected to Matt Stafford, which for the short term is fantastic. He puts him in situations to exceed expectations every time. The ball's right where it needs to be. It helps him change directions. He's confident that Matt Stafford's going to put him in a position to succeed. And that's how he gets a lot of his rack, is that he trusts Matt Stafford implicitly. He's also with Sean McVay, one of the most creative, scheming head coaches there is in the league, a Shanahan disciple. Fantastic spot for him. There couldn't be a better spot for him. He projects to be the number 1 target, probably over Cooper Kupp, definitely next year. I still think it's going to happen this year after the season he had. He was the wide receiver 4 as a rookie, and while Cooper Kupp did miss some time, I still think Cooper Kupp's probably going to miss some time here. So you can project him to be at least a solid wide receiver 1 this year and in the future, pending what happens to Matt Stafford. My wide receiver 6 is Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. He's only 23 years old and going into his 3rd season in the NFL. He is finally getting a quarterback that can throw him the ball. He has dealt with horrible quarterback play. Zach Wilson was the best quarterback he's played with before 8 snaps of Aaron Rodgers. It was depressing as a fantasy owner, but he was still a high-end 3, low-end 2 with the worst quarterback play imaginable. With Aaron Rodgers there, even if Aaron Rodgers is just a league average quarterback, Garrett Wilson will finish as a top 8 wide receiver. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. This guy is a bona fide wide receiver 1 who is ridiculous after the catch as well. Dangerous. He is an alpha target there, and by far the best receiver. There is no second. Breece Hall, their running back, who is a solid receiving back in his own right, is their 2nd best target. Mike Williams at this stage of his career, don't really want to hear it. He might play 4 games and get hurt again. He's coming off a torn ACL. He's going to be 30 years old. It's not really going to cut it. So as far as a short-term situation, absolutely fantastic. I would not be shocked if he leads the league in receiving this year. Long-term, kind of sketchy. At worst, he goes back to being a low-end 2, high-end 3 in the worst of scenarios. But I imagine they're not going to let the quarterback room get that bad again after Rodgers. So as far as this year, he's a top-shelf elite wide receiver 1. You just can't quite put him over some of these other guys yet, but with some consistency, he could easily join that tier and usurp a couple of people. And at 5, our final rookie, Marvin Harrison Jr., the heralded prospect out of Ohio State. He's set to turn 22 very shortly, and he went to a perfect landing spot. He has Kyler Murray to throw to him. He loves dominant X wide receivers. See DeAndre Hopkins pre-injuries. And he's going to be by far the top target earner there. The only player he has to contend with is an elite tight end in his own right, Trey McBride, but I'd be shocked if Marvin Harrison sees less than a 25 to 26% target share this year. He should be number 1 on the depth chart easily, no questions asked, and I'd be shocked if he's anything worse than a low-end wide receiver 1 this year, and I'd probably project him to be in that low-end 1, mid wide receiver 1 tier this year. and is going to be a regular constant here for the rest of his career. So at wide receiver 4, and the first player in our S tier of superstar elite wide receivers is Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver for the Detroit Lions. He's going into his 4th year, and he, of any player in this game, has the highest weekly floor with a decent ceiling as well. If I had to predict any one player to be a lock for a 20-point game, it would be ASRB. He's in a fantastic offense with Jared Goff, who was just re-signed to a 4-year extension, a good running game around him. He dominates from the slot. He's a power slot, so kind of a strange profile to be an elite wide receiver, but it works, and it's worked for years now. And he's one of the better route runners and one of the toughest wide receivers in the league. So as far as his short-term and long-term upside, elite, 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 elite. He's going to be a mainstay among the top 5 wide receivers for the rest of his career. Well, wide receiver 3 is Jamar Chase, wide receiver for the Cincinnati Bengals. He's going into his 4th year, and he's still just 24 years old, so he was young when he was drafted. He is an elite playmaker on all 3 levels of the field, and of all these elite receivers, he is tied to the best quarterback for the long term in Joe Burrow. They have a special connection ever since their years at LSU. And while Jamar Chase and Burrow have kind of dealt with little nagging injuries here and there, and Burrow with a couple season-ending ones, Jamar Chase represents the maximum level of upside of anyone in the entire league. He's had 2 50-point games before. We haven't seen stuff like this since Amari Cooper, really. So, of the top-end guys, he has the most upside. We just need to see a little bit more consistency. You should be able to expect elite wide receiver 1 numbers from him for probably just about the rest of his entire career. He's going to be locked in with Joe Burrow year after year after year, and there's no way they let him leave without signing a contract extension there. At wide receiver 2, we have CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys. So he's going into his 5th year. He's age 25. He is going to be an elite wide receiver for a long time. He's coming off a 400-point year and is the bona fide wide receiver 1 on his team. Top target earner, no questions asked. He's connected to Dak Prescott for at least 1 year. We'll see how Dak's contract extension talks go, along with CeeDee Lamb's for that matter. But elite wide receiver 1, top target earner. You should expect mid to elite wide receiver 1 numbers from him year in and year out for the foreseeable future. So, what we've all been waiting for, my top wide receiver. My top wide receiver is Justin Jefferson, wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. Now, he is the definition of QB proof. Nick Mullins was out there and he was having 20-point fantasy games. This guy is an elite stud. He's going to be a top-end wide receiver no matter what happens for the rest of his career. He could be in any situation. He is that darn good. He is the top alpha target, despite Jordan Addison being there, in O'Connell's scheme, which is great for him. And J.J. McCarthy, it remains to be seen. Like I said for Addison, I'm not really sure if that's a positive or a negative. They're going to be starting Sam Darnold, at least for the short term. For the long term, I don't really care. It's Justin Jefferson. He's elite. He's only 25 years old going into his 5th year. He's going to be an elite wide receiver 1 for years and years and years to come. Don't even sweat it. Don't even think about it. If I owned him in a league, I wouldn't consider trading him. No thank you. So that concludes my top 24 Dynasty wide receiver rankings. I hope you learned something, and do you agree with anything, disagree with anything? Should somebody else be in a certain spot? Please let me know in the comment section. Also, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and have a good day.